Good afternoon and welcome. Super excited to see all of you here for what I think is going to be a riveting conversation between these two esteemed men, Dr. Tom Kane, the director of the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard University, and Dr. Sean Reardon, the professor of education and sociology at the Stanford Accelerator for Learning. Welcome, friends. And my name is Henderson, and I'll be your moderator for this afternoon. I am the CEO of Reconstruction and the former chancellor of DC Public Schools. Welcome. So the title of this conversation is, Will U.S. Students Recover from Pandemic Learning Loss? And we've all heard, we've seen some of the NAEP results, we've heard how terrible and significant learning loss has been for U.S. students as a result of the pandemic. But you guys have been working on measuring the magnitude of the loss and the comparability of the loss. So tell us a little bit about your research and help us understand specifically what we're really up against.
Sure. So Tom and I and some colleagues have been working for the last 6 months or so to collect state test score data from, now we have 41 states, and we can use those data to sort of measure the extent to which test scores declined in every school district in the country, or at least in those 41 states, from 2019 to 2022, and then once we have the next year's data, we'll do it again. And so we have about 8,000 districts where we can say what happened, so much more detail than you can get with NAEP. And the news generally isn't good. So math scores declined by about a half grade level in the average district, but in some districts by as much as 2 grade levels. So kids are 2 years behind where their peers were a few years ago. Those losses were most pronounced in the highest poverty districts. They were most pronounced in the highest minority districts in the country. And they were larger in places that were remote for longer. But one of the things we found, I think, that was quite surprising was that when you look within a district, the poor students and the non-poor students lost equal amounts. The black students, the white students, the Hispanic students lost equal amounts. And so that tells us something about the mechanism by this, that it was more of a community-based or a place-based phenomenon, not something that was related to families' individual resources or capabilities of helping their kids. So communities that were hit hard by the pandemic in a variety of ways, all the kids in those communities suffered. And communities that were less hit hard or had more resources at the community level were less hit hard. And so I think one of the challenges we face is that the effects of the pandemic were really unequally felt across the country. And so that suggests we need maybe place-based mechanisms to address them.
Talk a little bit about comparability. Do people know that where they are against other people?
So this is why we created this education recovery scorecard, is that when the NAEP results came out, it was state by state, and people could read, oh, Massachusetts is down, 8 points in math, but my kid's probably okay. And so, and yet, if all I have is the state test scores, it's hard for me to compare how our losses compare to similar districts in other states. And so, with this education recovery scorecard, we report district by district in these 41 states, what were the magnitude of the losses, and the losses really are stunning in some places. So, like Richmond, Virginia, where our friend Jason Camrus is the superintendent, they lost the equivalent of 2 years worth of math instruction. And so, what we need to be, and by the way, in retrospect, it was probably nuts to think that we were going to be recovering from 2 years worth of loss. Have school districts teach like 150% of what they normally teach in a 180-day, 6-hour calendar just in this past couple of years.
Can you say that again for the people in the back? I mean,
yeah.
That might be the most profound thing that comes out of here. To expect that we would teach 150% is bananas.
Especially since we've spent the last, 30 years trying to improve productivity. We have made progress in K-12, but not nearly at that speed. And so I think we need to be thinking about solutions that go beyond the 180 days, that go beyond the 6 hours. And I know a lot of the folks in this room are working on solutions like that.
I mean, this is the question. Do you think we can really catch young people up?
Yeah, so I think my initial, my preconception would be, okay, the pandemic was this enormous thing that affected kids' lives in many ways, and they weren't in school a lot, and their families were suffering in many ways. So, of course, they fell behind. But systems and families and communities are resilient, and I think we'll see some catch-up. But what we did was we looked at the data for the 10 years before the pandemic, and we looked to find school districts where there was a sudden shock to test scores, where we saw either a big improvement or a big decline from one year to the next in a cohort of kids. That was sort of similar in magnitude to what we saw in the pandemic. And we said, when that happened, when there was a big shock that might have come from, a big employer closing and a big economic shock in the community, or some big change in the school district that led to changes in how much kids were learning. When there was a big shock, there was no bounce back. When a group of kids lost a half grade level in a district in 2015, they were still a half grade level behind in 2019. And so that's caused me and Tom to sort of rethink this idea that, well, maybe there'll just be some automatic bounce back. And I think also maybe it was naive to think there would be bounce back, because if you fell behind by half grade level, well, how would you catch up? You would catch up if somehow your school district suddenly could teach you a year and a half worth of learning the next year, which turns out not to happen in the real world. And so I think it's caused us to be a little bit more sanguine about the sort of possibilities of just a kind of a natural bounce back from this. At least the historical data suggests that's not the way it goes.
So I think there's been a lot of magical thinking. Just thinking, well, kids are resilient. Yes, we saw these big, losses, but the kids are going to be fine. The kids are not going to be fine unless we make it fine. And I think one of the things that is clear is we're not going to be able to do it, for the reasons Sean was describing, with just regular 180-day, 6-hour-a-day school. We're going to need to figure out how to provide other kinds of interventions, helping families, providing tools for families to work on reading and math at home, having tutors working with students on weekends or after school, extending the school year. So somehow we need to create a market for additional actions beyond what school districts do that would help students catch up. And we need to be thinking about what we need to do to make that market work that we don't have now, and that is some kind of mechanism for determining efficacy. We don't want just a bunch of snake oil. We want school and it's not clear whether it's school districts would be contracting with these service providers, or whether parents have some resources that they can spend on these things. We would need to talk through what's the right mechanism. But either is going to depend on having better evidence on efficacy of the different interventions. And states need to build the capacity to say something about efficacy of the interventions that are being delivered in their state.
So let me be provocative and say, yes, more time, and yes, more providers, and no, school isn't the only place that kids learn, and so we could build an ecosystem, and of course we need to measure efficacy. But to make that ecosystem work, the infrastructure that we would need to build is so complex, right? So first there would need to be parents and families would need to have a clear understanding of where their students are and where they are not, so that they could actually then pick the right intervention for them, right? And that would require some kind of information sharing from the school, which FERPA, blah, blah, all of the things, the PUS that don't allow you to share information about kids, hold you up. But let's assume that somehow or another the teachers could tell parents, this is what your kids need to work on. Then parents would have to be savvy enough to, or parents and teachers or school, somebody would have to be savvy enough to make the right decision to figure out which provider could actually deal with that child's need, right? And that assumes a marketplace of providers that are all meet some kind of standard. I don't know who decides that those people all meet this standard or when they do that. And I'm thinking a lot about the supplemental educational services thing that we did a few years ago, where it was the Wild Wild West. I see people shaking their heads. But, you know, assuming that there is a marketplace and parents actually know how to whatever, then there would also have to be some relay back to the school to help the school understand what the kid has experienced and a few other things. And we need to do all of that before we actually send kids into this wild new world.
I don't think we need to do, eventually, we would need to do all of that if we are gonna.
Yep.
You're describing Westworld.
Uh-huh.
I'm just trying to describe, like, you know, something between here and Westworld.
Okay.
So here's an example. There will be a lot of recrimination a year or two from now about the quality of the services that have been provided to school districts over the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. A lot of money has been spent, and we've not been tracking efficacy. In fact, most school districts don't have the data to know which kids got what, so that people like Sean and I can come along and use the data to help figure out, you know, what mattered or not. And so if there are people in this room who have been working with school districts, the place we got to start is making sure that the districts are tracking which kids are getting your services, and that there's a plan that we can actually measure the efficacy of it. So I would be happy, just as a first step, Kaya, if states were to use their data to say, okay, here were the providers that had enough tutors working with kids over the last couple of years in our state. We tracked, you know, efficacy. We could talk about what's the right methodology, but I'm sure we could do better than nothing, which is what we're doing now, and say, okay, that's our, you know, here are the effective tutoring providers in the state. If you're going to use state dollars, you know, there's some preference for those. Mm-hmm. So when I was saying a market for providers outside the school, it wouldn't have to be parents. Like, one version is parents are making the choices, but another version is school districts are just making more informed choices if they're doing the contracting. Mm-hmm. And right now, school districts are sort of at the mercy of contractors who are presenting. Everybody claims to have an efficacy study.
That's right.
I've read a lot of them, and I don't believe most of them. So we've got to get much more credible measures of efficacy out there.
But I think I would add the Wild West sort of fantasy you said. It's even worse in the sense that even if we built all that, I think we would still have to worry about the inequality that the pandemic produced.
Say more.
So the pandemic increased the amount of educational inequality between high and low income districts, or high minority and predominantly white or Asian districts, substantially. And the more affluent districts didn't lose as much. They still generally lost some ground, but not as much. And if you sort of have a marketplace where people are sort of trying to figure out what's best and how to implement it and things, the folks with the most resources and the districts with the most resources are going to better be able to do that. Yep. than the folks with fewer resources, fewer time to kind of sort through all the information and so on. And so you're going to end up kind of baking in the kind of inequality that the pandemic produced. Even if you sort of help folks recover, the recovery is going to be even bigger for the more advantaged places. And so we have to sort of think about a system that's not just helping everyone recover, but it's doing so even more so for the places that have the fewest historical resources to do so, whether that's at the family level or at the district level. So I think that's an additional challenge, that it's not just how do we get everyone to recover, but how do we do so in a way that actually rights the ship a little bit. And we don't have a lot of strategies. I mean, that's why we have so much inequalities, because we don't historically have lots of strategies for figuring out how to do that. And I think the challenge is even greater now.
So that $190 billion, though, that the federal government provided to K-12 since the beginning of the pandemic was all using the Title I formula.
Right,
so at least right now, a lot of those dollars are distributed, not perfectly, but crudely according to need.
That need most.
And so at least the dollars are there now, and I, so we're about to go into the summer of 23. We got two.
Wait, before we go to summer of 23, what have people done so far with the money?
We wish we knew.
So our research center is working with like 12 districts that are trying a number of things. So many are trying some version of high dosage tutoring. But rather than providing the kind of high dosage tutoring that the pre-pandemic research was based on, I see Alan Safran from Saga here. So that was, 3 times a week for the whole school year, something close to like 100 sessions. Yeah. In the districts that we're seeing, it's more like 15 or 20 for the average kid getting a tutor. And, maybe less than 10% of kids are getting tutors. So that's what I was saying before. Okay, it's disappointing, but what were we expecting? It was like, okay, people already had a full-time job trying to run a school district. The main constraint I've been seeing is not dollars, but it's just bandwidth in planning all these extra interventions on top.
Yes.
Summer included. And so somehow, we can't wish that constraint away. We need to be thinking about, okay, so how do we get some other providers into this space helping to help kids catch up?
Can I add 2 things to that? One, we're putting this on top of people who are already fatigued from 3 years of operating in the pandemic mess, right? People are beat down and tired and whatnot. And we have never had very clear, sharp strategies to do anything. So we're okay, we need clear, sharp strategies on people who are tired. There's a whole lot of money. And so what is going to happen? There's going to be a whole lot of wasted money. There'll be people who pop up and say, I can do this or that or the other, and everybody's just looking for a solution. And so here we go. And oh, by the way, we put all, I'm sort of disappointed that our only real solution to pandemic learning loss, the only idea we can come up with is high dosage tutoring. And we're not even doing that right, just one. Usually we have 25 things and people can't do 25 things. We got one thing and we can't get that together. So and oh yeah, where are all of these tutors coming from? Because there's no teachers. And so come on. Summer, you want to go to summer. We're gonna do what this summer? Because it's April right now.
Yeah, okay. So we've got 2 summers and 1 school year left with the federal dollars.
Maybe. Okay, let's go with that for a minute.
So it's a little late to be planning major stuff this summer, but here are 2 things that it's not too late to do. Number 1 is there should be public service campaigns, philanthropically funded, maybe, state and local governments helping out, making sure that parents sign up for summer school and attend. It's not enough to get kids to sign up. A regular attendance is notoriously difficult in summer learning. And so a continuing barrage of communications this summer around the importance of summer learning would be a start. But a second thing is we should be tracking, and I know there are SIS people, student data collecting people in the audience. We should be working with school districts to make sure they're tracking which kids are attending summer school this summer, because that's the only way we're going to be able to say anything in September, October about the value of summer learning. And we've got to be able to make that case in September, October about just how effective was, how important was summer learning during the summer of 23, so that districts plan much bigger programs for the summer of 24.
Yeah.
But I think the learning what works is not something individual districts are positioned to do. But I think the student information systems, like the companies that run those learning management systems or student information systems, track students' experiences in thousands of schools or districts across the country. And if those systems are set up to kind of capture information on what experiences are kids having, what kind of recovery efforts, and are they going to summer school, and are they attending, and what kind of courses are they in remedial courses during the year, things that could probably be collected, some of them already are collected or could be easily collected by those systems, then the data held in those systems could be used to learn at scale across lots of places that we're trying different things. But it's not a thing you can ask any individual district to do, and it's not a thing you can ask a state to do, because state data systems don't hold the level of detailed data that those student information systems have. So the people who have the kind of data or could collect it probably easier than anyone else, I think, are the companies that manage those and provide those student information systems. And if they, and I know some of you are in the room, if they could sort of think about how to capture that data and then use it for research, or make it, partner with researchers in ways that would enable the system to sort of learn what were the most effective things we did this summer, what should we double down on, and what should we abandon given time and resources we have, we could take this as an opportunity to learn something useful for the field, not just something kind of, well, I tried this in my district and it seemed to work or it seemed to not. Like there's a real chance there, I think, but the players can't be individual districts or even states, I think.
I agree with that, Sean, and I think it's got to be a coordinated plan, because if you just leave it to the research firms and the researchers to help tell you, they'll tell you about this time next year at the earliest, and that's too late. Mm-hmm. So we have to have a plan going into the summer. What data are we going to have? What data are we going to collect? When are we going to have it? What analyses are we going to do? And if we have that, we can have a report out in October where we're saying what was the efficacy of stuff, so that everybody here understands the whole idea of leverage, so that that study could leverage some big chunk of the billions of dollars that districts still have but haven't solidified their plans, for yet.
Yep. And who does that? Who pulls the people together and coordinates the effort? Whose responsibility is that?
Could help.
Asking for a friend.
Yeah.
Foundations might be the people who could convene.
That somebody's got to step up, but we know. So we know.
You are Tom Kane, right? The Harvard researcher. You are Sean Reardon, Stanford. Call your friends. Call the Department of Education. Let's get the thing going.
I've been calling my friends, and a couple of them that are here in the audience are the people who've been answering, but not everybody's answering. But we've got to. It's not super complicated. There are a few assessment providers, NWEA, iReady, STAR assessments. Everybody's is using one of the three or something, something else. And the beauty of those is there's a spring and a fall assessment. If we have an agreement with one of those testing folks to be able to merge in the data on attendance. It's not rocket science but as Sean's saying, it'd be nice to be able to pool across like 10 or 15 districts. Like we wouldn't have to have like 100. We could provide much clearer evidence on that.
All right, that sounds like a plan. This is a conference full of educational technologists. What tools could or should they be developing to help kids either make up or even leapfrog the learning loss that we're facing?
So, as I said, I think trying to find productive ways to use kids' time outside of school. I know that's a hard place to go right now because there's not a ton of dollars for it. But I wonder if but I would be encouraging folks to be thinking about that. What kinds of tools could be used to essentially, extend the school day by providing resources for kids or families, or virtual tutoring after school, or virtual tutoring on weekends. It may not be as effective as in-person, in-school tutoring, but I think expanding the amount of learning time students get, that's the critical thing right now.
Yeah, but I think what's really important to remember is we ask schools to do 975 zillion things all at the same time, right? And we're like, now extend the learning time, right? And I think the point that you're making is school is not the only place where kids learn. And we've got to maximize all of the places that kids are learning because our poor schools are under siege. We're already asking them to do 150% of what they couldn't do before, right? And that is a whole thing. And kids still need more time, more instruction from a variety of people. I think this causes us to think about who can provide instruction in different ways, because if we keep ourselves locked into the frame of a certified teacher is the only person who can do X, Y, or Z, then we should just give up, right? Because that's not happening. And so it causes us to rethink who is an educator, what the different provision models are for the delivery of instruction. It causes us to think about the whole thing differently, but it needs to be more than just people who are running schools thinking about this, right? We cannot, the used to be me, we can't do this. Schools cannot do this alone. And I think it's no longer supplemental providers. I think one of the most important things that I watched happen during the pandemic was when schools were utterly failing as an institution, supplemental providers stepped up. Our nonprofits, our community partners, there were people who met the needs of kids and families in ways that schools just could not. And as we looked at pandemic recovery, instead of bringing those people in to say, all right, how do we split up the work? We put them right back we call them out of school time providers or partners or whatever, instead of bringing people in to really divide the work up in new ways. And I think if the only way that kids are going to get more instructional time is if we broaden the group of people who are able to provide it.
With some efficacy built, some kind of infrastructure built in, I think most appropriately led by states to do that, to, say, we tracked student outcomes, here's our best estimate of what was the efficacy of these different things. So it's not totally a wild, wild west. One thing that we haven't started talking about yet, but it's time we start to think about it, is what kinds of policies do we need to have in place under the assumption that many districts will not have caught up by the end of next year. We've already had 3 graduating classes. We're going on 4. Kids that we've left stranded in the labor market, either not ready for school or not getting enough help for school. We can't keep doing that. So we need to be thinking about, okay, what changes in policies should school boards, state education agencies, state legislatures be thinking about? So should there be a 13th year of high school that's optional for kids to be able to take some additional courses, get some help filling out college applications and so forth. Should ninth grade, or sixth grade, be like triage years, where if you get to sixth grade or ninth grade and you're behind in math and literacy, you get a ton of extra help with tutors and so forth. I mean, one of our challenges right now is we're trying to reinvent every grade and subject at the same time. If instead we focused on sixth grade and ninth grade, and just really say we're going to concentrate resources there, maybe that's one. I'm not saying that's the solution, but that's one of the things we ought to be thinking about. Extending the school year, is something that ought to be on the table.
What you got, Sean?
I think we should also think about expanding the focus of recovering and helping kids beyond instruction and beyond math and reading. Like, we see the problem in math and reading tests because that's what we test everyone in. But kids also fell behind, I guarantee you, in every other subject, whether we test it or not. They also suffered in lots of ways that weren't about lost instruction or that won't be fixed by more instruction. The mental health crisis among kids, enormous, hugely exacerbated by the pandemic. The sort of social isolation, the ways that kids' sort of social skills may have been hampered by it. We don't measure it, so we can't sort of say, oh, kids are a half grade behind in social skills. But, they spent a lot of time, my son included, on Xbox or something, and not out sort of socializing like they might. So I think it's important not to say the problem we measured was math and reading skills. Let's spend all our energy on math and reading and forget that kids have suffered in lots of other ways too. The other thing is, it's not just schools that caused kids to fall behind. Like, it's not, the pandemic didn't just close schools for part of the year or all of the year in some places. The pandemic affected every aspect of kids' and families' lives. People lost jobs, people were sick, people died, kids couldn't see their friends, they couldn't participate in sports and activities. It was a all-encompassing thing. That's why we call it a pandemic, I guess, right? So it affected, lots of things affected kids, and we see that in our data. We look to sort of see what other factors beyond sort of school closures affected how much kids lost. And we see some evidence that things like the extent to which adults report mental health problems, depression and anxiety in a community is related to how much kids' test scores went down. The death rate in a community is related to how much kids' test scores went down. Things like that. So there's more was going on, and so I think we need to think about the strategies for helping kids catch up as not just about instruction and not just about math and reading instruction, and so I think that leads us to a more comprehensive set of strategies that are about kind of mental health services and supports for kids to develop the kind of social skills that they may not have had a chance to and things like that. So it's easy to think it's a school math and reading problem because that's what we measured, but it's a much broader problem than that.
And in order to fix that, it requires coordination of agencies that don't even generally talk to each other, right? When I think about what it took for us to create an information sharing agreement with Child and Family Services and the Department of Health and DC Public Schools, it took us 18 months to create a memorandum of understanding that would allow us to share information so that we could begin to address kids and families in a more holistic way. We're not set up for that, right? Yeah. And so when you talk about policies that need to be in place, we also need to figure out how we can share information in a way that allows us to treat kids holistically and not just as math and English problems.
So any structural issue like that, Kaya, or any of these policy changes, making optional 13th year sounds trivial, but that would have to go through school boards and we got to get started. If we don't get started soon having those debates, so here's another concrete thing philanthropy could do is fund people to write up some of these ideas about, you know,
not just the idea, right? But real clear implementation.
Yeah.
Because the problem is, even when we have the idea, high dosage tutoring, we don't actually implement the idea with the fidelity that it takes to get the evidence that the research shows. Right?
Totally agree. But we need to get those ideas on the policy shelf for state legislators out there to start debating. Because if that's going to take at least a year.
What role does the U.S. Department of Education play in this? Asking for a friend.
So I hate to say it, but I feel like, so the U.S. Department of Education essentially disarmed in the end of 2015 with the Every Student Succeeds Act, and now, for good or ill, it's a 50-state and 13,000 school district discussion, which we just need to adapt to. That's the reality we're in. And so that just means we've got to have a set of policies or proposals or ideas more worked out than just a one-liner, and have those presented at the National Council of State Legislatures, the Council of Chief State School Law. Like, we got to seed the ideas around the country, because it's I think gone are the days where the federal department could say, here's a really important thing, we got to get everybody on board.
Yep. We have 3 minutes left, and gosh, time flies when you're having fun. We have pulled these things apart. One, we have stated how terrible the problem is. We've also pulled apart how tricky it is to be able to come up with the kinds of solutions that we need. But I like to end things on a high note, a hopeful note. What is it that you want this audience to walk away from this conversation thinking about, as not just thinking about, but that propels them or motivates them forward positively and doesn't leave them walking out of here thinking, Jesus Christ, there's nothing we could do?
You want to start? I think slow.
Yeah. I mean, I'll go back to this sort of point I was making earlier. I think like a consortium of folks who have access to and collect the data that could help us learn what's effective and not, the convening power of philanthropy, the kind of systems that will help. Like, we have 13,000 districts. During the pandemic, everyone was trying to be a public health expert. Mm-hmm. Everyone was trying to be a doctor. Everyone was trying to figure out how to Zoom work. Like with 13,000 people, all trying to figure the same thing out. That doesn't seem super efficient. We have a long tradition of decentralization, so we want to respect that too. But I think...
Do we, Sean? Is that the way to get things done?
I'm just
hand
waving.
That's for another panel.
I'm hand waving at that. but I think there are opportunities, I think, with the kind of connections between data infrastructure and technology and school districts and states to kind of build something that none of those players could do on their own, mm-hmm. that would help us both more rapidly innovate and learn from that kind of innovation in ways that might help us get out of this better. But we got to do it with an eye towards equity at the same time, because mm-hmm. otherwise we're just going to sort of bake in the inequality that we already have.
Tom?
So what I think would make a really big difference 10 or 20 years from now is if states took the baby step now of using their data to measure the efficacy of different providers in their state, and start to use their regulatory power to direct school districts and/or parents towards those providers who've been proven effective. I think if we started down that road, and then maybe, at some point we'd get to Westworld, but between now and then, if we just had better measures of efficacy that we could, believe in and trust, I can't tell you the number of times I've been surprised that something I was super optimistic was going to work turned out not to work, or something I was like pessimistic about ended up working. So I can't tell you what's going to work, but I can tell you that it's this kind of efficacy measure that will be the way that will improve.
I could not think of two better people to help us figure this problem out than the two of you. Thank you for spending your time. I hope you all learned a few things, and we'll see you next time.